My son packed me off to a nursing home, but when the will was read, he couldn't believe his ears. The click of the suitcase zipper echoed through my bedroom like a death sentence. Not because of the sound itself, but because it came from my son's hands. "There we go, all packed," Brian said, not bothering to hide the relief in his voice. He straightened up, rubbing the small of his back, as if the simple act of bending over had exhausted him. At 46, my son had started collecting the small complaints of middle age like badges of honor. I, Margaret Maggie Rosen, 78 years old with more life in me than he had ever bothered to notice, sat perched on the edge of my bed. The same bed where I'd rocked him through croup and colic, where I'd read him stories about brave knights and dragons until his eyes fluttered closed. The same bed where I'd held him after his father died, his 15-year-old frame racked with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere primal and bottomless. Now he couldn't wait to zip me away like winter clothes in summer. "Is this really necessary, Brian?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of hearing it break. "One little fall." "Two falls, Mom," he corrected, his tone clipped in that way he used with difficult clients at his law firm. The tone that said he'd rehearsed this argument and anticipated all possible objections. "Two falls in 3 weeks. The doctor said you were lucky not to break a hip the second time." I looked down at my hands, spotted with age but still strong. They had kneaded bread dough this morning, had watered my orchids, had typed an email to my property manager about quarterly returns, but Brian didn't see capable hands. He saw fragility. "I can hire someone to come in a few times a week," I suggested. Janet from church offered. "We've been through this." Brian checked his watch, a gaudy thing his wife Paige had given him for their anniversary. "The shuttle from Pine Brook will be here in 20 minutes. Pine Brook Senior Living. Even the name sounded like a lie, a marketing euphemism for what it really was, the place where families stashed the elderly when they became inconvenient. I'd driven past it countless times over the years, watching as the paint peeled and the landscaping grew, increasingly neglected. No flowers by the entrance, just concrete and cigarette butts, and tired-looking staff on smoke breaks. Of course, that was before I bought it. Brian went to the window, checking the driveway again. His BMW gleamed in the morning light, freshly washed. Always the perfect appearance, my son. Perfect suit, perfect haircut that hid the thinning at his crown, perfect smile that hadn't reached his eyes in years. "The house will sell quickly," he said, more to himself than to me. "The market's hot right now. The Hendersons down the street got 50,000 over asking just last month." My stomach clenched. So that's what this was about. Not my safety, not my well-being. My house, my beautiful 3-bedroom colonial, with the garden I'd tended for 40 years, was worth more to him empty than it was with me in it. "And what happens to my things?" I asked, looking around at the life I'd built. The watercolor I'd painted on my 60th birthday, the bookshelf my late husband Edward had built by hand, the photographs chronicling generations. Brian waved dismissively. "We'll put the important stuff in storage. You can take some personal items to Pine Brook, but the rooms are small. Paige and I will sort through everything else." I bit my tongue. Paige, who had once returned a sweater I'd given her for Christmas because it wasn't her aesthetic. Paige, who had gradually reduced our family dinners from weekly to monthly to when we can fit it in. Paige, who looked at my antique china cabinet with dollar signs in her eyes. "And how often will you visit?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "As often as we can, Mom. You know how busy things get with the kids' activities and my caseload." He had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. "But Pine Brook has lots of activities. You won't be lonely." I nodded, as if I believed him. As if I hadn't already done the math. As if I didn't know that his "when we can" meant holidays, perhaps, and maybe the occasional guilty Sunday. The truth was, Brian had been pulling away for years. After Edward died, when I needed my son the most, he'd retreated into his work, his family, his busy, important life. Our conversations grew shorter, more perfunctory. He stopped asking about my days, my thoughts, my dreams, assuming, perhaps, that at my age I'd stopped having any. He never asked how I spent my time when I wasn't babysitting his children or making the holiday dinners he never helped clean up after. Never wondered about the financial acumen I developed after his father passed, leaving me with more debt than savings. never questioned how I'd not only survived but thrived. In his eyes, I was just an old woman who crocheted Afghans and watched game shows. "The shuttle's here," Brian announced, peering through the curtains. "Let me get your suitcase." I rose slowly, not because I needed to, but because it matched his expectations. I'd gotten good at playing the role of the fragile old mother. It was what he wanted to see after all, and right now it served my purposes. He helped me into my coat with the careful movements one might use, handling a glass figurine. I let him guide me down the stairs, his hand firm on my elbow as if I might disintegrate without his support. The shuttle was indeed waiting. A white van with Pine Brook Senior Living emblazoned on its side in fading green letters. The driver, a young man with kind eyes, took my suitcase from Brian. "I'll take good care of her, sir," he said with a wink in my direction. If Brian noticed the wink, he didn't react. "I'll visit this weekend," Brian promised as he helped me into the van. "Once you're settled," I smiled and patted his cheek. "Of course you will, dear." We both knew he wouldn't. But only one of us knew it didn't matter. As the van pulled away, I watched Brian standing in the driveway of my home, already on his phone, probably calling his real estate agent. He didn't wave, didn't watch until the van disappeared around the corner. Just turned and walked back toward the house, shoulders lighter for having shed his burden. Little did he know, I wasn't the burden he should worry about. I settled back against the seat as the driver navigated through my neighborhood. "Everything set for Operation Surprise, Ms. Rosen?" he asked, meeting my eyes in the rearview mirror. I smiled, a real smile this time. "Yes, Marcus. Everything is right on schedule." Because what Brian didn't know, what he had never bothered to learn, was that he wasn't dropping me off at some rundown nursing home. He was dropping me off at my property. The shuttle rumbled past manicured lawns and pristine storefronts before turning onto the road that led to Pine Brook. I watched as the scenery gradually changed, houses growing farther apart, businesses looking less polished. To an outsider, it might have seemed like we were heading into the forgotten part of town, and in many ways, we were. That's exactly why I'd chosen it. 30 years ago. "Almost there, Ms. Rosen," Marcus said, adjusting his mirror to catch my eye. "Everyone's excited for your official move-in day." I nodded, smoothing my cardigan. "I hope the renovations on the East Wing are still on schedule?" "Yes, ma'am. The contractor says they'll be finished by next month, under budget too." "Excellent." The van turned into a long driveway flanked by pine trees, the only part of the property that lived up the Pine Brook name when I'd first laid eyes on it. Back then, in 1993, the facility had been called Sunset Haven, a cruelly ironic name for a place where the sunset was the last thing many residents would see. I still remember the day I first walked through those doors, just 6 months after burying Edward. My grief was still raw, but something else had emerged alongside it: determination. After settling Edward's debts and selling our vacation property, I found myself with a modest sum to invest. Everyone, my financial advisor, my friends, even the banker, pushed me towards safe options. Treasury bonds, CDs, things that a widow my age should consider. But Edward hadn't married me for my ability to play it safe. The Sunset Haven property came onto my radar through Martha Kleinman, my bridge partner and a retired real estate agent with her ear to the ground. "The place is a mess," she'd told me, over coffee. "Owners desperate to sell after those health code violations. Could be had for a song." A song, it turned out, that matched my budget perfectly. The van slowed as we approached the facility, and I smiled at the transformation. Gone was the peeling paint and cracked concrete. The building now sported a fresh sage green exterior with white trim, flower beds bursting with perennials, and a covered entrance where residents could sit and enjoy the air. The sign, recently updated, read Pine Brook Senior Living in elegant script, with a community of dignity written beneath. Dignity. That had been my guiding principle from the beginning. What no one knew, not Brian, not my friends from church, not even Martha, was that I didn't just invest in the nursing home. I became its owner, operating through a holding company I named after Edward's favorite fishing spot. I hired a management company, kept my name off every document a resident or family member might see, and got to work transforming the place. It wasn't easy. The first year nearly broke me, but I'd watched my husband build his construction business from nothing. I'd kept his books, managed his schedule, soothed angry clients. I knew how to work. And work I did. Replacing staff, updating facilities, creating gardens where residents could grow vegetables if they were able, or simply sit and feel the sun if they weren't. I instituted a policy that no resident would be addressed as sweetie or dear unless they specifically requested it. They were adults, not children, and would be treated as such. By the end of the decade, Pine Brook had turned a profit. A modest one, but enough to purchase a struggling facility in the next county. Then another on the other side of the state, all operating under the same holding company, all managed by people I trusted implicitly, and all unknown to my increasingly distant son. "Here we are, Miss Rosen," Marcus announced, pulling up to the entrance. Elizabeth Chen, the facility director who'd been with me for 15 years, was waiting at the door. She played her part perfectly, clipboard in hand, professional smile in place. "Mrs. Rosen, welcome to Pine Brook. I'm Elizabeth Chen, the director." She extended her hand as if we hadn't just had lunch together last week to finalize the details of today. "We're so pleased to have you joining our community." I took her hand, noting the slight squeeze she gave mine, our private signal that everything was proceeding as planned. "Thank you, dear. It's a big change. Change can be difficult," Elizabeth acknowledged, her voice carrying just the right note of practiced sympathy. "But I think you'll find Pine Brook to be a warm, welcoming place. Why don't I show you to your room while Marcus brings in your luggage?" She led me through the front doors, past the recently renovated reception area with its comfortable seating and fresh flowers. Residents nodded or waved as we passed, some in on the secret, others simply greeting a new face with the kindness I'd insisted be part of Pine Brook's culture. My room was at the end of the hallway in the west wing, the first section I'd renovated all those years ago. Elizabeth opened the door with a flourish, revealing a space that was modest but comfortable. A far cry from my home, of course, but warm and personal in a way Brian probably hadn't expected. "We've prepared everything according to your specifications," Elizabeth murmured as Marcus set down my suitcase. "The private line is connected, and your office is ready whenever you'd like to use it." "Thank you, Elizabeth." I moved to the window, which overlooked the vegetable garden, and beyond it, the pond I'd had installed during the second renovation. "This will do nicely." When they'd gone, I sat in the armchair by the window and allowed myself a moment of sadness. Not for the home I'd left behind. Houses were just structures, after all, but for the son who had so thoroughly misunderstood who his mother was, who had never bothered to look beyond what he expected to see. Well, he would see now. Because I had no intention of quietly fading away in the nursing home my son had chosen for me. I had plans. Plans that involved Brian learning humility, one devastating surprise at a time. Brian's first visit came 3 weeks after he'd dropped me off. Not the weekend he'd promised, but I hadn't expected him to keep his word. When Elizabeth called to inform me he was at the front desk, I quickly transformed. I mussed my normally neat silver bob, changed from my tailored slacks into a shapeless floral house dress, and draped an afghan across my lap. The finishing touch, reading glasses perched low on my nose, magnifying a large print romance novel I'd never normally touch. "Mom?" Brian called, knocking perfunctorily before pushing open my door. "How are you settling in?" I looked up slowly, as if it took effort to focus on him. "Brian? Oh, what a nice surprise." He stood awkwardly in the doorway, a cellophane-wrapped fruit basket clutched in one hand. The price tag was still attached, $19.99 from the supermarket down the street. Last-minute guilt, neatly packaged. "You look comfortable," he said, glancing around the room. His eyes lingered on the few family photos I'd brought, the worn paperbacks stacked on the bedside table, the crocheted blanket covering my legs. Standard old lady props, carefully selected. "It's not home," I said softly, injecting just enough quaver into my voice. "But everyone's been very kind." Brian nodded, setting the fruit basket on the dresser. "That's good. The house is already on the market, by the way. 3 showings scheduled for this weekend." "No, I miss you." "No, how are you really doing?" "Just straight to business." "So soon?" I asked, letting my hand tremble slightly as I marked my page. "I thought perhaps you might want to keep it in the family." Brian shifted his weight, not quite meeting my eyes. "Well, the market's hot right now, Mom, and Lisa's tuition for Cornell is due soon. Besides," he added with forced cheerfulness. What would we do with all that space? What indeed? Certainly not offer it to me again. Will you stay for lunch? I asked. They're serving, I pretended to struggle, tapping my temple. Oh dear, what was it again? My memory isn't what it used to be. The flash of discomfort on his face was worth the performance. I can't today, Mom. Paige has a charity luncheon, and I promised to drop her off. Of course, I nodded understandingly. Maybe next time. He stayed 15 minutes. I timed it on the antique watch hidden beneath my sleeve. Before leaving, he helped me open an applesauce cup I could have opened blindfolded, speaking louder with each passing minute as if volume could bridge the gulf he'd created between us. Do you need anything before I go? He practically shouted as he prepared to leave. I suppressed a wince. No thank you, dear. I'm fine. After he left, I changed back into my normal clothes and headed to my real destination, the small office Elizabeth had arranged for me in the administrative wing. There, I reviewed the quarterly reports from all 3 facilities, signed off on a new landscaping contract, and made notes about the renovation plans for the East Wing. This was my real life, the one Brian had never bothered to discover. The next few months established a pattern. Brian visited rarely, once every 3 weeks or so. Always with the same awkward brevity. Always with some excuse to leave quickly. Each time, I played my role to perfection, gradually escalating the performance. I forgot names of staff members I'd known for years. I asked him the same questions twice in one conversation. I let him see me shuffle to the bathroom, gripping furniture for support I didn't need. And I listened. Oh, how I listened. I listened when he took phone calls in the hallway, thinking I couldn't hear. Calls to the real estate agent about the sale of my house. We're hoping for a quick close. Calls to Paige about my belongings. No, Mom won't notice if we sell the china cabinet. Calls to his financial advisor about his share. Once Mom's estate is settled, we're thinking of a vacation home in Naples. Behind the scenes, I was busier than I'd been in years. The renovations to Pine Brook continued, transforming the tired facility into something truly special. A new garden with raised beds, so residents in wheelchairs could still get their hands in the soil. An updated dining hall with restaurant-quality meals. A physical therapy room with equipment that rivaled any private gym. I paid for most of it myself, dipping into investments that Brian didn't know existed. The staff, witnessing my generosity firsthand, became even more protective of my secret. They played along brilliantly when Brian or Paige appeared, referring to me as Miss Rosen with just the right note of professional detachment. During one of his visits, Brian brought Paige and the children. My grandchildren, normally affectionate, seemed bewildered by their new instructions to be careful with Grandma. They perched stiffly on the edges of the visitor chairs, clearly eager to leave. Paige barely looked at me, spending most of the visit on her phone. When she did speak, it was with the false brightness one might use with a toddler. Are they feeding you well here? She asked, practically shouting. Yes, dear, I replied mildly. Though I do miss my kitchen. Well, someone your age shouldn't be cooking anyway, she said, patting my hand condescendingly. It's much safer here. Later that afternoon, after they'd gone, I watched from my window as Brian loaded the family into his BMW. Before driving away, he took a call, laughing easily in a way he never did with me anymore. I made a decision then. It was time to set the final stage of my plan in motion. That evening, I asked Elizabeth to arrange a meeting with my lawyer. Are you sure, Maggie? She asked, concern etching her kind face. Your health is acceptable. There's no rush. I'm sure, I said firmly. I've seen enough to know exactly what I need to do. The lawyer arrived 2 days later. Patricia Winters, a sharp-minded woman in her 50s who'd handled my business affairs for decades. Like everyone else in my inner circle, she had no love for the way Brian had treated me. You're absolutely certain about this? She asked after I outlined my plans for my will. It's rather definitive. I nodded, looking out at the garden where several residents were enjoying the late afternoon sun. Brian made his choice when he packed my bags without asking what I wanted. Now I'm making mine. Over the next few weeks, I finalized my will with Patricia's help. I arranged for my most treasured possessions, the ones with sentimental rather than monetary value, to be donated to the women's shelters I'd supported anonymously for years. I documented every conversation with Brian, Every dismissive comment from Paige. Every broken promise. Not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. And then, 3 months before my unexpected heart attack would change everything, I wrote Brian a letter. Not in anger, but in truth. A letter he would receive only after I was gone. "You're standing on land you never took the time to understand," I wrote in conclusion. "And while I forgive you for discarding me, I cannot protect you from the consequences of your choices." I sealed the letter and gave it to Patricia, along with final instructions for the will reading. It would be my last act as both mother and businesswoman, a lesson in the dignity that Brian had denied me, delivered from beyond the grave. The day I finalized my letter to Brian was unseasonably warm for October. Through my office window, I could see the maple trees on the grounds blazing with color, fiery reds and golds catching the afternoon light. I'd always loved autumn, the sense of things coming to their natural conclusion, the beauty in the ending. Patricia sat across from me, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed the final draft of my will. At 62, she was younger than me but old enough to understand what I was doing, and why. We'd been friends for nearly 30 years, ever since she helped me set up the holding company for Pine Brook. "This is quite the document, Maggie," she said, looking up at me over the rim of her glasses. "Are you certain you don't want to include some kind of olive branch? A way back for Brian if he shows remorse?" I considered this as I sealed the envelope containing my letter. "No," I said finally. "Brian is 46 years old. If he hasn't learned empathy by now, a conditional clause in my will won't teach it to him." Patricia nodded, shuffling the papers back into her leather portfolio. "And you're sure about the rental property? It's quite the bomb to drop." "Ah, yes. The rental property. Perhaps the most delicious part of my plan." 6 years ago, when Brian and Paige were between houses, they'd found what they called the perfect duplex in the historic district. Modern amenities wrapped in Victorian charm, walking distance to the children's private school, convenient to Brian's office. The rent was below market value, a steal, Brian had called it, never questioning why the landlord was so accommodating. Because the landlord was me, or rather, one of my subsidiary companies. I'd purchased the property years earlier as another investment. When Brian mentioned they were house hunting, it had seemed the perfect opportunity to help without him knowing, preserving his precious pride while ensuring my grandchildren had a lovely place to live. But then came the comments over Sunday dinner. "These old folks' homes are such a racket," Brian had said, not realizing the irony of complaining the very person who owned 3 of them. "They charge an arm and a leg to warehouse old people. It's practically criminal." Paige had nodded her agreement. "My friend Stephanie put her mother in a facility last year. Basic care was $5,000 a month. And for what? A tiny room and mediocre food." I'd merely smiled and passed the potatoes. "How fortunate that you'll never need to worry about such things for me." They'd exchanged a look but said nothing. 2 months later, after my second fall, Brian was packing my bags. Now, signing the final page of my will, I made my decision. The rental property stays in the plan. Brian and Paige can continue living there, but at market rate, no more family discount. Patricia's lips twitched. Current market rate would more than double their rent. "Yes," I said calmly. "It would. And if they decide to move?" "They won't," I replied, thinking of how often Paige bragged about their address, how convenient it was to Brian's firm. "They're too attached to the prestige of the neighborhood." Patricia slipped the will into its envelope and sealed it. "Is there anything else you'd like to include before I file this?" I hesitated, then reached into my desk drawer and removed a small, leather-bound journal. "This," I said, sliding it across the desk. "I want this to go to Lisa, Brian's daughter. She's the only one who still looks me in the eye. The only one who asks questions about who I am, not just how I am." Patricia took the journal and added it to her files. "I'll make sure she gets it. Anything specific you want me to tell her?" "Tell her it's her grandmother's story. The real one, not the version her father created." After Patricia left, I walked through Pine Brook, nodding to residents and staff alike. In the dining room, preparations for dinner were underway. The head chef, lured from a respected restaurant downtown with the promise of creative freedom and reasonable hours, waved to me from the kitchen. "Ms. Rosen, would you like to taste tonight's soup? I've tweaked the recipe." I spent the next hour in the kitchen, tasting and suggesting, laughing with the staff who knew me as their employer, not just another resident. This was the life I'd built for myself after Edward died. Meaningful work, respectful relationships, purpose. Later, back in my room, I opened the safe hidden behind my watercolor of Edward's favorite fishing spot. Inside was a copy of the letter I'd written to Brian. I read it one more time, ensuring every word was exactly what I wanted to say. Dear Brian, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I hope my passing was peaceful, though I suspect your primary concern is what comes next. Specifically, what comes next for you. You've always been practical that way. It's not entirely a flaw. Your father was practical too, but he balanced it with compassion, something I've watched drain from you year by year. 3 months ago, you moved me to Pinebrook Senior Living without asking what I wanted. You sold my home, the home where you grew up, the home your father built shelves and fixed leaky faucets and breathed his last. You did this, you said, for my safety, my well-being. But we both know that's not the whole truth, don't we? What you never bothered to discover is that the facility you so hastily deposited me in has been mine for nearly 30 years. Yes, Brian. Mine. Along with 2 others like it. While you assumed I was filling my days with television and crafts, I was building a business empire focused on treating the elderly with the dignity they deserve. You're standing on land you never took the time to understand. There's more you don't know. The duplex you and Paige have called home for 6 years? I own that too, through one of my subsidiary companies. The understanding landlord who's kept your rent well below market value has been me all along. I'm not telling you this to hurt you, though I know it will sting. I'm telling you because you've lived your entire adult life underestimating me, and in doing so, you've missed the opportunity to truly know your mother. My will outlines the specifics, but here's what you need to understand. I've made provisions for everything I care about. My business, my properties, my personal treasures. You'll receive exactly what your actions have earned you. Not out of vengeance, but out of justice. Not as punishment, but as consequence. Perhaps someday you'll understand that the greatest inheritance I could have given you wasn't money or property, but the wisdom to value people for who they are, not what they can give you. With love, despite everything. I placed the letter back in the safe and closed it with a decisive click. 3 months. 3 months to leave out my remaining days in the community I'd built, surrounded by people who respected me. 3 months before Brian would learn exactly who his mother had been all along. I only wished I could see his face when he found out. My heart gave out on a Tuesday morning in February. It was quick and relatively painless, a small mercy after watching Edward's prolonged struggle years before. I'd been in the garden, checking on the early crocuses with Dorothy Simmons, one of our oldest residents, when I felt the telltale tightness in my chest, the shortness of breath that told me my time had come. Dorothy held my hand until the paramedics arrived, but we both knew it was too late. My last conscious thought was that at least I would miss the budget meeting scheduled for that afternoon. My funeral arrangements had been meticulously planned years in advance. No service, no flowers, no fuss, just a simple cremation, and my ashes scattered at Edward's favorite fishing spot. What I did specify, however, was the reading of my will to be conducted at Pinebrook in the sunroom where I'd spent so many pleasant afternoons. I wish I could say I was there to witness it, some ghostly presence hovering in the corner, watching as my final act of truth-telling unfolded. But I can imagine it clearly enough. Patricia would have arrived first, impeccably dressed in one of her tailored suits, portfolio in hand, face appropriately solemn. Elizabeth would have been there too, along with Marcus and several other staff members who'd been in on the secret all these years. Brian and Paige would have arrived precisely on time. Brian never liked to be early or late for anything, probably dressed in appropriate morning clothes. Black suit for him, tasteful dark dress for her. Their expressions would be composed, perhaps with a hint of impatience. After all, they had a house to empty, assets to liquidate, a vacation to plan. Patricia would begin formally, professionally, the way she handled all legal matters. Thank you all for coming. As you know, we're here to read the last will and testament of Margaret Eleanor Rosen. Brian would nod, perhaps reach for Paige's hand, a public display of unity and grief. He might even dab at his eyes, though I doubt any real tears would fall. He had already mourned the mother he thought I was years ago. when he decided I was nothing more than a burden to be managed. Before we begin, Patricia would continue. Mrs. Rosen left specific instructions that this will reading take place here at Pinebrook Senior Living and that certain facts be disclosed before the formal reading. This is where Brian's composure would first crack. A slight furrow between his brows, a tilt of his head. Facts? What facts? Patricia would look to Elizabeth, who would stand and address the room. Pinebrook Senior Living, along with Riverside Meadows in Grafton County and Seaview Gardens in Marshfield, have been owned and operated by Lakeside Holdings since Lakeside Holdings was the sole property of Margaret Rosen. The silence that would follow this announcement would be profound. I can picture Brian's face, first confusion, then disbelief. Finally, the dawning horror, as the implications began to sink in. "That's not possible," he would say, looking around as if expecting someone to agree with him. "My mother was a homemaker. She had no business experience." Marcus might step forward then. Mrs. Rosen was not only the owner but the driving force behind every major improvement at all three facilities for the past 30 years. She had an office right down the hall. She reviewed the books every week. Every week? But she only moved here 6 months ago. Mrs. Rosen has been a regular presence here since she purchased the facility, Elizabeth would explain gently. She simply became a resident when you moved her in. I imagine Brian standing at this point, his carefully controlled world tilting on its axis. "This is some kind of joke. My mother left her house keys under the flower pot. She couldn't remember her doctor's appointments. She needed help opening applesauce cups. That's when Patricia would remove my letter from her portfolio. Margaret asked me to give you this. Perhaps you should read it before we continue." I can see him snatching the envelope, tearing it open, his eyes scanning the lines I'd so carefully carved, the color draining from his face as he reads about the duplex, about my businesses, about the mother he never bothered to know. Paige would be looking at him in alarm now, sensing that something had gone terribly wrong with their carefully laid plans. "What is it?" she would demand. "Brian, what does it say?" But Brian would be too shocked to answer. Still staring at the letter, Patricia would allow a respectful moment before continuing. Now, to the formal reading of the will. She would open her portfolio, extract the document, and begin to read. "I, Margaret Eleanor Rosen, being of sound mind and body, hereby declare this to be my last will and testament." The details would unfold like body blows. Lakeside Holdings, with its 3 profitable senior living facilities, bequeathed to a trust to be managed by Elizabeth Chen and the existing administrative team. My house, which Brian had sold without consulting me, revealed to have been transferred to my name alone after Edward's death. The proceeds from its sale now redirected to a scholarship fund for nursing students specializing in geriatric care. My personal possessions, the ones with true sentimental value, Edward's fishing tackle, our wedding album, the quilts my mother made, all donated to the women's shelters where I'd volunteered quietly for decades. The family heirlooms Brian and Paige had already started selling online, revealed to be high-quality reproductions I'd had commissioned years ago, after noticing how Paige eyed my mother's silver tea service. And the duplex? Now officially owned by a different subsidiary with instructions to raise the rent to market value, effective immediately. "To my son, Brian Edward Rosen," Patricia would read. "I leave the sum of $5,000 with the recommendation that it be used for therapy to unpack whatever made you treat your mother like a burden rather than a person." Brian would be ashen by now, the letter crumpled in his fist. "This can't be legal," he would sputter. She was confused, not of sound mind. "I'll contest it." Patricia, prepared for this reaction, would calmly extract another document. Mrs. Rosen underwent a complete cognitive assessment 3 months ago. The results, verified by 3 independent physicians, confirmed she was fully competent to make these decisions. She would slide the document across the table. "She anticipated your response, Brian. She documented everything." As the reality set in, I imagined Brian looking around the room at the staff who knew the real me, at Elizabeth, who had been my friend and colleague for 15 years, at Patricia, who had helped me build my quiet empire. All these people who had seen me clearly, while my own son had seen only what he expected to see. A feeble old woman, a burden, an inconvenience. "She also left this for Lisa," Patricia would say, producing my leather-bound journal. with strict instructions that it go directly to her, unopened. The final insult to Brian's authority, a direct line of communication to his daughter, bypassing him completely. In that moment, standing in the sunroom of the facility he had dismissed as a warehouse for the elderly, Brian would finally understand what he had lost. Not an inheritance, not property or money. A mother. 3 months after my will reading, Brian did exactly what I predicted. He contested the will. Patricia called it his tantrum phase, and she handled it with the cool efficiency I'd always admired in her. She presented the documentation I'd meticulously gathered over the years, medical evaluations confirming my mental acuity, witness statements from staff and residents, financial records showing my steady hand at business for decades. The judge took exactly 12 minutes to dismiss his case. "Your mother," the judge reportedly told him, "appears to have been a remarkable woman who documented her wishes with extraordinary clarity and forethought. My sympathies for your loss, Mr. Rosen, but this will stand." Brian tried again, hiring a high-priced attorney from his firm. Another dismissal. Then he attempted to claim elder abuse by the staff at Pine Brook, suggesting they had manipulated me for financial gain. When that failed, he went after Patricia, filing an ethics complaint that was quickly rejected. By the 6-month mark, he'd spent more than the $5,000 I'd left him, with nothing to show for it but mounting legal bills and a tarnished reputation at the courthouse. Even his law partners began distancing themselves, uncomfortable with his increasingly desperate attempts to overturn a legally ironclad will. Meanwhile, life at Pine Brook continued much as it had when I was alive. Elizabeth ran the facilities with the same compassion and attention to detail I'd insisted upon. The East Wing renovations were completed on schedule. The garden bloomed as spring turned to summer. The raised beds I designed, now named Maggie's Garden, in my honor. The duplex situation resolved exactly as I'd anticipated. When the rent doubled, Brian and Paige initially threatened to leave until they realized that comparable properties in the same neighborhood were even more expensive. Pride kept them from downsizing, from admitting to their social circle that their circumstances had changed. So they stayed, writing monthly checks to the company that had once been mine, the bitter irony surely tasting like ashes each time Brian signed his name. But the most interesting development came from an unexpected quarter, my granddaughter Lisa. One warm afternoon in June, she appeared at Pine Brook, clutching my journal in her hands, eyes red-rimmed but determined. She asked to see my room, which had been preserved as a kind of memorial. Elizabeth's idea, not mine, though I would have been touched by the gesture. Lisa sat in my favorite chair by the window, looking out at the garden where I'd spent my final moments. "I never knew," she told Elizabeth. "I mean, I knew Grandma was smart. She always helped me with my math homework when Dad was too busy. But I had no idea she built all this." Elizabeth smiled. "Your grandmother was extraordinary, but she was also very private about her accomplishments." "The journal explains so much," Lisa said, running her fingers over the worn leather cover. "She wrote about how Grandpa's construction business gave her the foundation, how she learned everything by watching him, how after he died, she needed purpose, not just existence." She looked up, tears welling. "She wrote about me, too," said I, reminded her of herself at my age. "Through Patricia, who kept me informed of developments as a courtesy to an old friend." I learned that Lisa began visiting Pine Brook regularly, not out of obligation or guilt, but genuine interest. She spent hours talking with Elizabeth about business management, with Marcus about transportation logistics, with the residents about their experiences. By summer's end, she had started an internship at Riverside Meadows, the second facility in my small empire. Not in administration, but in resident care, learning the business from the ground up, just as I had. Brian was furious, of course. He forbade her from having anything to do with those people who turned your grandmother against me. Lisa, 19 and headstrong, moved into campus housing and paid her own tuition with a combination of scholarships and her internship salary. In September, on what would have been my 79th birthday, Pine Brook held a small ceremony to dedicate the newly completed community center. They named it the Margaret Rosen Center for Dignity and Aging, a title that would have embarrassed me in life but seemed fitting in death. Lisa attended. Brian and Paige did not. Around town, people began telling stories about me, the old lady who owned the place she died in. Some versions were wildly exaggerated. I became a secret millionaire, a cunning strategist who'd planned her revenge for decades, a bitter old woman who disinherited her son out of spite. None captured the simple truth. I was just a woman who refused to be erased while still breathing. Patricia, ever the guardian of my legacy, corrected the wildest rumors when she heard them. Margaret wasn't interested in revenge, she would say. She was interested in truth. There's a difference. 2 years after my death, Pine Brook became the model for a state initiative on elder care reform. Elizabeth was invited to speak at conferences, sharing the philosophy I'd built my business on, that aging doesn't diminish personhood, that dignity isn't a luxury but a right. Lisa graduated with honors and joined the management team at Seaview Gardens, my third facility. She brought fresh ideas and technological innovations while maintaining the core values I'd established. On her office wall hangs a framed photo of me standing in the garden at Pine Brook, not as a shrine to the past, but as a reminder of possibility. As for Brian, I hear he eventually stopped fighting. The anger burned itself out, leaving only a hollow space where understanding might have grown. He and Paige still live in the duplex, still pay market rate rent, still share awkward holidays with Lisa, who loves her father but doesn't share his worldview. Some days, I imagine he walks past Pine Brook, on his way somewhere important. Maybe he pauses, looking at the thriving community that bears his mother's name. Maybe he wonders, just for a moment, about the woman who built it all while he wasn't looking. I hope so. Not out of bitterness, but because it would mean that even now, even after everything, he might still be capable of learning. People tell stories about me now, the old lady who owned the place she died in. But I'm not interested in becoming folklore. My legacy isn't in the buildings that bear my name or the legal battles I won from beyond the grave. It's in every elderly person treated with dignity at my facilities. It's in Elizabeth's steady leadership. It's in Lisa's determined face as she carries forward what I began. And yes, perhaps it's even in Brian's slow awakening to the possibility that his mother was more than he ever imagined. My story isn't over. It continues in the lives I touched, the values I championed, the truth I insisted upon until my final breath. Because dignity isn't something you give to your elders, it's something you recognize was always there. That recognition, late though it may be, is the only inheritance that ever truly mattered.